The secret to learning is 3 steps. Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Turns out if you repeat things enough times over time, it sticks. So, as you watch these videos and listen to my melodious elocution as I narrate these slides, you will hear things sometimes that you've heard before. That should be an indication that it's important. And hopefully, if I tell it to you enough, it'll stick. So let's talk about how we represent things in GIS, or specifically how we represent the world as a map. So when we talk about mapping information, we've got 2 very different sort of environments. Discrete objects are the first, and these are things that exist in one place and not in another. They have a stop and a starting point. They can be expressed as a simple pass-fail test, a 1-0 yes-no binary kind of idea. It's like a road. It has an edge, it has a start, it has a stop. It's like a house. It has 4 walls, minimum, maybe 3. Could be 1 if it's round. I'm getting off in the weeds here a little bit. It is clearly defined. Now, personally, if you're trying to figure out if something is a discrete object, and you're not sure what a discrete object is, think of it like this. A discrete object is anything that passes the pirate test. Oh, you're going to say, what's the pirate test, Dr. Harmon? The pirate test is simple. Imagine you were captured by pirates, and they decided that as a GIS professor you're a dirty, rotten scoundrel, and they're going to make me walk the plank. The plank obviously is attached to and is therefore part of said pirate ship. The pirate ship being the discrete object, and me being the test subject. As I walk the plank, I'm on the pirate ship, every step I take on the pirate ship until I get to the end of the plank. At some point in time, I will take a step to where I'm no longer on the plank. And as I plummet to my certain death in the ocean, I am no longer on the pirate ship. I have exited the boundary of the object, pirate ship, and entered the continuous surface of ocean. Okay? Continuous data is something that exists over an entire map area. Elevation, temperature, precipitation. Now I said ocean is continuous. It would depend on the scale. If the scale of your map is smaller, or if the extent of your map is smaller than the ocean, then it would appear to be a continuous entity. If it's not, then it would be a discrete object. And how could you tell? Simple. If you're swimming in the ocean and you're swimming toward the shore, the moment you run aground onto the dry land, you're no longer in the ocean, hence discrete object. If you're measuring the elevation of the water and you crawl up onto the beach and you're still measuring the elevation of the land, and you climb up on a tree and you're measuring the elevation of that, then you're measuring elevation, and that is truly a continuous data, a continuous surface. Continuous data, it has a quality that exists over an entire map area. It's always present, and it changes from place to place. So when we look at maps themselves and we look at one type of data, we're going to talk about the data types in a minute, but for now let's just talk about this one. This concept is called vector data. Vectors are points, lines, polygons, and annotated features. So a point is a point. A line is a line. A polygon is a shape. And an annotated feature is basically a label. If we want to get into the beauty of it all, points are 0-dimensional, lines are 1-dimensional, polygons are 2-dimensional, annotations are labels that act like points. Another thing that we have to do in GIS is generalizations. And I always say that if you ask me how we fare at generalizing, or how we fare at representing the real world in a GIS, my answer is not too good, because the real world has some unique properties. First of all, there's a whole bunch of it, and second, it's just ate up with details. And both of those create problems when you're trying to generate geospatial data layers. And so we can't put every detail of everything in a GIS. Too much information. So we generalize things. And so we, instead of using a really complicated aerial photo that has every car, every tree, every swimming pool, every shadow mapped out, we create lines. And this example is something called a digital raster graphic. Earlier I said that one type of data was vector. The other type is raster. Rasters are grid-based, and that would include anything that's a picture or made of pixels. In this example, we had a vector map that has been digitized, and so that's what a digital raster graphic is. In this example, the little black shadowy things in the middle are the houses on the left. The black lines are the edges of the roads, and there are some problems pointed out by those two arrows that go up to where it says errors, and that would be the fact that there's a road there on the right that doesn't exist on the left, and there's a house there or a garage or a shed or something on the left that doesn't exist on the right. We generalize different things at different scales, and we represent things differently at different scales. For example, here we have two maps of Portsmouth, Virginia, one at 1 to 24,000 and one at 1 to 50 million. At 1 to 50 million, Portsmouth, Virginia is a point. That's all. The point feature in that map covers up the entirety that is Portsmouth. Whereas at 1 to 24,000, you can see detail of the community of Portsmouth. Polygons at one scale can be points or lines at a different scale. Here we have different images of Portsmouth at different scales. We've already talked a little bit about vector data and raster data in terms of what they are. Here we have two data sets that are in two different data models of the exact same thing, that being hydrology layers. In other words, stream networks. On the left is vector data, points, lines, and polygons. Obviously, this is lines. Different thicknesses, different widths, and different ways the lines are made, whether they're solid or dashed, indicate different qualities of the stream. That's the left. On the right is raster. Remember, raster is pixel-based or grid-based. It's tiny little squares. And so it's not going to be as smooth and curvy and fine in detail because the limits of the raster are the size of the cells. And so on the right, we get lines of two different color, the brown and the blue. The blue loosely translates to the hashed lines on the left, and the brown translates to the bolder lines on the left. Both of these models are accurate and are fine representations of the hydrology at this location. They're just different formats, and formats limit the ability to mimic reality. And you have to ask, how important is it and how much detail do I need? And that will help you decide which data model you should be working in. How does it all work? Well, vector data model works like this. Individual features are stored as a series of XY coordinates in a rectangular coordinate system. In other words, X and Y move over X so many, move up Y so many, and you get a point. If it's a polygon, you have basically a line that encloses back on itself. Everywhere the line changes its vector or its direction, you add another point. These points become effectively nodes in the line, nodes being the spot where the direction of the line changes. Then we also have lines. And I get a little hung up sometimes on the verbiage of this. I tend to think of all the vertices as nodes. I suppose technically the nodes are at the terminal ends of the lines, and the vertices are the points where you change your vector. But what I'm most interested in and what you need to realize is that those point-like features are what steers the direction of the line and control the shape of the polygon and identify the location of the points. Now, also turns out that most spatial data has two components. There's the feature and the attributes. Every feature is linked to an entity in a data table containing information, and that information is called the attributes. In the older file formats like shape files, they're stored separately and they're linked together by the software. In the newer formats, instead of using shape files, we use feature classes, and feature classes are they're different because the data is stored with the feature as a single unit. It's called an object-oriented architecture. Feature classes, similar objects, same sort of thing, all stored together, etc. So when we look at this, we have the georelational model, features stored and attributes are stored separately, linked by some common ID. That's what shapefiles are. Object-oriented model, features and attributes are stored as a single unit. It reduces the overtime of matching. It's simpler and helps maintain data integrity. For most users, you can't tell the difference with it when you're working with it. Vector data has some distinct advantages. It's designed for storing discrete objects because you can be much more precise where things are at, where they stop and where they start. You can store many more attributes. They're super flexible and allow you to do a lot of cool cartographic things. In other words, you can make really pretty maps. They have a more compact storage of information, and they are ideally suited for certain types of analysis, particularly things that look at areas, lengths, and or connectivity. You can also use them to store surfaces, and here we have two examples of vector-based surfaces, and one obviously is a raster because it says raster. Contour lines are basically ISO lines that follow a specific elevation, and from this you can get some idea of the shape of a feature simply by looking at where these standard fixed levels of elevation occur. The one on the top right is something called a TIN, or a triangular irregular network. It's this mathematically complicated collection of tiny triangles that have some non-overlapping things that go on that help decide whether you make one triangle into two triangles and then take each of those triangles and whether you make them smaller. Anyway, the math all works out, and basically what you get is a whole bunch of triangular planes. And the thing about a plane is if you have 3 points in space, you can identify a direction, a slope, and an elevation for everything inside that shape. And so if you cover a surface with it, you effectively get a nice elevation model. Where the other one is a raster of, say, elevation. And every cell in that grid, every pixel, has one value, and that value is the elevation at that location. And it would generate a model that looks somewhat similar to the TIN. TINs, nodes, and edges that are defined by these facets. Like I said, neat little collection of fancy mathed out triangles. A digital elevation model, a DEM. You will in time come to appreciate that the semantics of elevation modules, digital elevation models, is not completely simple. There's several different types or flavors, if you will, of these things. But basically this is how it works. A digital elevation model has cells or pixels, each of which contain a single elevation. They follow a regularly spaced array. They are a regularly spaced array of elevation values. In other words, if this is like a 30-meter grid, every 30 meters across you hit a new cell. Every 30 meters up and down you hit a new cell. For every cell you have an elevation value. When you put it all together, it looks like this. Now, once we have the raster data, what do we do with it? Well, we need to be able to place it somewhere, and so typically what we do is we identify that upper left-hand corner, the XY location. We find where that goes on the surface of the Earth, and then we have columns and rows that go out from there in an even distance. When we look at continuous data, raster is typically the best way to store it. It works really well for continuous changing values such as elevation or distance. For some things, analysis in raster data is much more flexible, and it works well, better than vector does for some applications. In fact, some things that you can do are only possible in raster datasets. We have other raster datasets called discrete rasters. They essentially store features, but in the raster format, and they have relatively few values that change abruptly, but they change abruptly from one category to another. And so it's basically rasters trying to be vector, if you will. If we look at continuous rasters, continuous surfaces, you have a field or a variable that changes continuously, like elevation, temperature, that sort of stuff. In other words, you have many potential values, and adjacent cells rarely share the exact same value. Then we have these. This is a digital raster graphic or a scanned image. Basically, a paper map was designed that was probably vector based, and it was then electronically scanned so that it is now in raster. And while it looks like it's got a lot of cool information, the cool information is strictly from your ability to interpret what you see. Because if you were to break this down at the raster level and you look at the attributes for individual cells, the only thing you're going to get is a number. And that number corresponds to the color of the cell on the map. It doesn't tell you if it's water, road, land, industrial, waste, sewage disposal, or whatever. It tells you that it's red, white, purple, blue, green, etc. Pictures are also raster, come in a lot of different formats: JPEGs, MPEGs, bitmaps, and others. In order to be displayed, to be utilized in GIS, they too have to be georeferenced to some sort of a known coordinate system, and we will spend some time talking about coordinate systems. If you don't have your data projected or have at least reference to a known coordinate system, it's really hard for GIS to do anything with it. If we look at value raster versus picture raster, what do we get? Value raster is all about values. What's the elevation here? What's the elevation here? What's the elevation here? Picture rasters are all about colors, and you visually interpret what those colors mean. In other words, it literally is just the colors in the picture, and you have to understand or learn or know how to interpret that. How does raster resolution impact things? The same way resolution impacts everything. Smaller resolution means finer detail. Larger resolution means more coarse, rough detail. Storage space increases by the square of the resolution. As you make your resolution smaller, it gets significantly, the data sets become significantly larger. So when you have raster data and you want to look at very large areas at very high precision, it becomes a real problem real fast. As far as storing attributes, if we look at roads, for example, they can have a whole lot of stuff to go along with them. The problem with raster data is you would have to have a new layer for each attribute. So speed limit, road type, average slope, number of lanes. These are all things that could be included in the attributes if these were vector. Because they're raster, we would have to have a separate raster for every field. That makes this very inefficient. But raster works really awesome for certain things. Here are some of the raster analysis functions that are out there that we use on a pretty common basis. First one being density. You got a lot of vector data, i.e. points, and you want to know where most of the points are. A density raster graphic basically gives you different colors related to the number of features per unit of area, and from that you can get a map very much like the top left. We can also use rasters to calculate something called a distance raster, which basically takes one set of features that you identify, like in this case it's these roads, and it asks a very simple question and it does the calculation. How far am I from the road? And for every pixel in the entire data set, every grid spacing in the raster, it says what is the closest line and how far away is it. And for that cell it gets the number, and that number is that distance. And then if you display that distance value in the right kind of a map, you get something that looks like that. We also use rasters for something called interpolation. Interpolation is figuring out what exists in the in-between. In other words, we can't typically collect data everywhere, but we collect data where we can. And we want to know what exists and what we can expect to find in those areas we never sampled, we never collected information at. And so we assume that places are similar to places that they're close to, and that as you get further away they're less like that and more like something else. And what interpolation does is it do either mathematics, statistical, or other means. It simply generates a new data set that gives you an estimate or a predicted value for every cell in the grid, in the raster, between all the known points. And it maps out, looks like that. Now once you have all these fancy rasters, like for example an elevation raster, you can calculate the least cost path from one point to another. For trying to walk the least steepest path, that will find you the way to go from A to B without walking uphill. We can also do cool things like view sheds, where you identify a point and you look at the three-dimensional aspect of the elevation, say what can and cannot be seen from that location. We can also use rasters to create buffers around other features. It's another common use.